The first rule of our kitchen was silence. Not an oppressive silence, but the focused, reverent hush of a sanctuary. My husband David was a chef, but that word was too small. He was a culinary archaeologist, a reconstructor of lost flavors. His world was one of precise temperatures, historical cookbooks, and the relentless pursuit of an authenticity so pure it bordered on the austere. Our home was a restored farmhouse in the Hudson Valley, a temple to seasonal, local, silent perfection. His love was a reduced consommé, clear, intense, and stripped of all fat and frivolity. I was Claire, the chef's wife, the forager, the gardener, the quiet keeper of the larder that supplied his genius. Our love was a perfectly balanced dish, every element in its place. I mistook the absence of bitterness for flavor, the absence of noise for harmony. My secret rebellion was a hidden jar of supermarket strawberry jam in the back of the pantry, a cloying neon red sin against our orchard's perfect, unsweetened preserves. It was my monument to the artificial, the easy, the pleasurably vulgar. The contamination of our sterile kitchen began with a truck, a vibrant, foolishly painted food truck, plastered with cartoon pigs and the words "The Wandering Swine," broke down in front of our property one iron gray November afternoon. David was in the city, consulting for a museum exhibit on Neolithic fermentation techniques. I was pruning the last of the kale. The man who climbed out from under the chassis was a figure of glorious, greasy chaos. He was big, broad-shouldered, with a wild tangle of dark hair, and a beard that seemed to be an ecosystem of its own. He wiped his hands on jeans already stained with 100 different kind of grime, leaving a fresh smudge of engine oil. His smile when he saw me was immediate and unguarded, a flash of white in his smudged face. "Well, ain't this a picture?" he said, his voice a warm, rolling baritone that seemed to vibrate the cold air. "A woman with kale in her hands and a look that could frost windows. Any chance you've got a phone that works and a total disregard for the concept of stranger danger?" His name was Jasper. He was a pit master, a nomadic purveyor of pulled pork and irreverence. His rig, his pig palace, had given up the ghost. He needed a tow, a mechanic, and possibly a exorcism. I led him to the kitchen phone. He didn't walk through our home. He seemed to expand to fill it, his presence a loud, smoky draft in the still air. His eyes, a lively, mischievous brown, scanned the room, the hanging copper pans, the spotless marble counters, the single perfect specimen of a black crimped tomato on the windowsill like a museum piece. "Wow," he whistled, not with awe but with amused disbelief. "You could perform surgery in here. Where's the life, the spatter, the stack of dirty spoons?" "Efficiency prevents waste," I said, automatically repeating David's mantra. "So does death," Jasper chuckled, picking up the tomato, weighing it in his greasy palm before setting it down with exaggerated care. "My kitchen looks like a happy crime scene. Smells like one too, but in the best way." The tow truck was an hour. We drank coffee at the scrubbed farmhouse table. He talked. He talked about the politics of wood, hickory versus applewood, about the zen of a 16-hour pork shoulder, about feeding line cooks at 2 a.m., about the gospel of hot sauce and the healing power of a properly greasy biscuit. His language was one of abundance, of mess, of communal, noisy satisfaction. David's cuisine was a solo performance for a discerning few. Jasper's was a loud, messy party for anyone hungry. He left a business card, sticky with something unidentifiable, on the table. A cartoon pig winked at me. On the back he'd scrawled, "For the Kale Queen. Thanks for the coffee and the culture shock." That was the first illicit ingredient introduced into my pristine larder. I didn't throw the card away. I slid it between the pages of my foraging guide, where it left a faint, greasy stain on a picture of hen of the woods mushrooms. He came back a week later, his truck supposedly healed, with a thank you that consisted of 2 foil-wrapped, grease-soaked parcels. "Pulled pork," he announced as if presenting rare truffles. "My grandma's vinegar sauce. Coleslaw with a kick. Eat it, live a little." David was at a tasting menu pop-up in Brooklyn. I ate the sandwich at my own kitchen table. an act that felt profoundly transgressive. It was a riot of texture and contradiction, tangy, sweet, smoky, soft, crunchy, messy. Juice ran down my chin. I licked my fingers. It was the most delicious, shameful thing I had eaten in years. The first betrayal was sensory, gustatory. I began to find David's exquisite, clarified broths tasteless. His forage salads, arranged like Japanese gardens, seemed like pretentious still lifes, not food. I craved noise, grease, bold, unapologetic flavor. Jasper's world was a shout. David's was a whispered haiku. I was starving for the shout. The second betrayal was logistical. Jasper's truck was wandering through our county for a month, doing a stint at a local brewery. He asked if I wanted to see how real people eat, a late-night service at the brewery. I told David I was attending a webinar on myco-remediation for soil health. The lie was a bland, healthy-seeming puree hiding a chunk of gristle. The brewery was a cavern of noise, laughter, and the humid, yeasty smell of beer. Jasper's truck was parked outside, a beacon of fragrant smoke. He worked in a tornado of motion, barking orders, flipping buns, his face glowing in the heat of the griddle. He fed me scraps over the service window, a bit of crackling, a spoonful of baked beans, a pickle spear. It was food eaten standing up, with fingers, accompanied by a loud joke and a communal roar from the crowd. It was alive. After the service, we sat on the tailgate of his truck, sharing a beer. He was exhausted, exhilarated, smelling of smoke and sweat and hard work. He kissed me then, and it tasted of pork fat, cheap beer, and a thrilling, unrefined vitality. We didn't go to a bed. We fumbled in the cramped, overheated cab of his food truck, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 meals, the air thick with the scent of our transgression. It was hurried, clumsy, and utterly real. Afterwards, I cried, hot, silent tears of confusion. He held me, his big hand rough on my back. "Shh," he murmured. "It's just the reaction. You've been on a starvation diet of pretty food. This is just nourishment." He reframed my guilt as a nutritional deficiency. I clung to it. Thus began my life as a secret eater of forbidden food. I was the chef's pristine wife, the curator of heirloom seeds and wild herbs. And I was the woman in jeans, sneaking into the smoky, noisy world of the food truck, feasting on messy, delicious lies. I kept 2 sets of recipes: the household ledger, fermentation timetables, seed germination charts, menus for David's private dinners, the secret stash, notes hidden in my canning journal, the location of the brewery, the times of his service, scrawled observations like, "His hands are scarred from burns, not thorns." The logistics required a smuggler's cunning. I kept a change of town clothes in the garden shed. I bought a cheap phone, a burner, he called it, and kept it wrapped in plastic in a hollow in the old oak tree. I became a master of bland, credible alibis, testing soil pH at different farms, volunteering at the seed library, long walks to identify new foraging patches. David, whose trust was as clear and settled as a perfectly strained consommé, accepted it. His world was one of observable, chemical reactions. The slow, emotional fermentation of deceit was beyond his scope. His concern was for my energy. "You're foraging so much lately, Claire. Don't deplete yourself. The land needs balance." The guilt was a slow, toxic ferment in my gut. It would bubble up violently during David's acts of meticulous, creative love. When he spent a week building a cold, anaerobic chamber in the cellar just to make a historically accurate fish sauce. When he presented me with a single, perfect, hand-painted plate he'd commissioned just for my forage breakfast. When he talked about our future, about buying a neighboring orchard, about creating a closed-loop, self-sufficient ecosystem for our work, our life. A legacy of flavor, he'd say, his hand clean and precise, covering mine. His love was the slow, careful cure. My betrayal was the introduction of a rampant, spoiling bacteria. To cope, I began to subtly sabotage my own garden. I'd overlook aphids on the lettuce. I'd forget to water the delicate microgreens. I was trying to introduce fallibility, to make my own rotten core seem like part of a larger blight, not a solitary chosen decay. Jasper's world was one of glorious, generous spoilage. He believed in feeding the multitude, in excess in the beauty of the slightly burnt edge. He loved me with the hearty, uncomplicated appetite of a man who worked with his hands. But I began to see a flicker in his eye, the look of a man who enjoys a novelty, but whose true love is his smoker, his rig, his road. With him, I felt consumed. With David, I was preserved. David, the master of detecting the subtlest off flavor, began to sense the contamination. Not evidence, but a strange note in the bouquet of our life. My new restlessness in our quiet evenings. The unfamiliar smoky scent that clung to my hair sometimes. A scent no foraging trip ever produced. The way I'd push his elaborately composed plates around, eating little. Your palate seems fatigued lately, Claire, he said one evening, tasting a spoonful of his bone broth with a critical frown. He used the sommelier's term, dulled. Has your foraging brought you into contact with something overpowering? That food truck that parks at the brewery, perhaps? I've heard the smoke alone can deaden the senses. It was a quiet, precise warning. He had identified the source of the olfactory pollution. The crisis was precipitated by a gift. Jasper, in a fit of sentimental, greasy-handed romance, gave me a mason jar. It was filled with his homemade, fiery, vinegar-based barbecue sauce. The label was hand-drawn, a cartoon pig holding a heart. Underneath, he'd written, "For the Kale Queen, to make life less green." It was the antithesis of everything in our pantry. It was loud, acidic, vulgar. It was also a piece of him, a core flavor. I hid it behind rows of my own perfectly sealed, unsweetened apple butter. Weeks later, David decided to host a collaborative dinner with a famed Japanese kaiseki chef. It required a full inventory and deep clean of our pantry, a ritual as precise as surgery. I was at a real meeting of the County Horticultural Society. He conducted the inventory. I returned to find him in the kitchen, standing perfectly still at the central island. Before him, like an exhibit in a trial, sat the mason jar. The winking pig stared out, brazen and joyous. David's face was pale, his expression that of a man who has just found a fly in his most precious, centuries-old balsamic vinegar. He looked up, and his eyes held a hurt so profound it was silent, a flavor too terrible to name. "Who?" he asked, his voice thin and strained, the sound of a delicate crystal glass cracking, "has been bringing processed condiments into my larder?" The question was perfect, and it gutted me. He didn't accuse me of infidelity. He accused me of a profound aesthetic betrayal. I had allowed a cheap, mass-produced sentimentality, a vulgar acidity, to breach the sanctum of his pure, curated craft. There was no recipe for recovery, no reduction that could save this. The evidence was a clash of culinary philosophies. I confessed. Standing in the heart of his temple, I recited the recipe of my deceit. Jasper, the truck, the brewery, the clumsy coupling amid the grease and steam, the hidden phone, the secret schedule written in my foraging notes. I listed every ugly, delicious ingredient. As I spoke, I watched the elaborate, beautiful meal of our life congeal and spoil on the plate. His face moved through the stages, the shock of the first foreign taste, the grimace of recognition, the final, empty swallow of acceptance. I hadn't just broken a vow, I had proven that his entire world of purity, technique, and elevation was a fragile construct, vulnerable to the simplest, greasiest assault. I had chosen the street food over the tasting menu, and in doing so, declared his life's work a pretentious lie. When my voice finally failed, he walked to the sink. He picked up the mason jar, unscrewed the lid, and slowly, deliberately, poured the vibrant red sauce down the drain. He watched it until the last drop was gone, then rinsed the jar clean. "I have dedicated my life," he said, his back to me, speaking to the sink, "to the extraction of essence, to removing the noise, the fat, the impurity, to find the true, clear note of flavor." He turned and his eyes were empty, like cleared plates after a failed dinner. "You, Claire, you were not the rare foraging find I believed you to be. You were a craving for junk food, a palate that preferred the loud, the easy, the fake. I was a chef. You were a customer at a drive-thru. He shook his head, a final, dismissive gesture. We cannot share a kitchen. The ingredients are incompatible. He left that night. His packing was a swift, efficient mise en place for a life elsewhere. He took his Japanese knives, his grandfather's mortar and pestle, the photograph of us at the opening of his first restaurant, young and full of a cleaner hunger. He left the house, the kitchen, every tool and terracotta pot of our shared life. I don't want any of it, he said at the door, a single knife roll in his hand. The pantry is contaminated. The stock is ruined. The aftermath was a long, flavorless fasting. David communicated through a lawyer who was as crisp and efficient as a perfectly julienne vegetable. The divorce was a clean, clinical separation. He was brutally, ethically fair. My family, who saw David as the pinnacle of cultured success, was appalled. You had a Michelin-starred life, Claire, my mother, a former food critic, said coldly, and you traded it for a grease-stained paper bag. When the brewery stint ended, I went to the usual lot. The space was empty, just oil stains on the asphalt. I called the number on the winking pig card. It was disconnected. A bartender said Jasper's rig had headed south. Following the warm weather, I guess. Said something about Texas. Bigger brisket, bigger skies. The hearty, nourishing, messy love I had craved was, by its nature, itinerant. It fed the crowd and moved on. I had been a novel local ingredient, a seasonal special. The season was over. I sold the farmhouse. I couldn't bear the silent, accusing garden, the empty kitchen that mocked my hunger. I moved to a small, featureless apartment in a suburb, a place with a microwave and a smell of generic cleaner. I took a job writing copy for a corporate catering website. My world reduced to describing flavorful, artisanal, handcrafted experiences that I knew were mass-produced lies. I live in a state of permanent blandness now. The silence here is not the sacred hush of the kitchen, but the dead quiet of a microwave spinning with nothing inside. Sometimes I catch myself sniffing the air when a neighbor grills, and a pang of loss, sharp as vinegar, hits me. I sought to trade a life of rarefied, exquisite taste for the loud, honest satisfaction of a full belly. But I was not a hungry pilgrim. I was a gourmet who committed a deliberate act of vulgarity. And now I am left with a permanent, hollowed-out hunger that no takeout menu in the world can ever fill.